Welcome to Sleepy Love Tales, soothing romantic stories to help you relax and fall asleep. Let us know where you're listening from in the comments. If soft, heartfelt tales help you unwind, be sure to subscribe so you never miss a moment of calm. Now, let's begin tonight's story. When the corn turns gold. The Nebraska air in late April carried the scent of possibility. It smelled of damp, overturned earth, of lilac bushes teasing their first buds, and of the clean, crisp promise of a spring that had finally wrestled winter into submission. 17-year-old Hannah Callahan hummed a tuneless melody, her fingers nimble as she pinned her father's work shirts to the clothesline. The wind, a constant companion on the plains, billowed the fabric like a ship's sails, and with each gust the faint, reassuring rumble of a tractor reached her from the neighbouring farm. Eli's tractor. It was the background music to her entire life, a steady thrumming that meant the world was turning as it should. She smiled, her thoughts drifting from the chores at hand to the dress hanging in her closet, a cascade of periwinkle chiffon she'd found at a thrift store and altered with her mother's help. Prom was 2 weeks away. 2 weeks until she and Ryan would step into the brightly decorated community centre, leaving their small-town lives behind for one magical night. Ryan, with his easy smile and quarterback confidence, was her ticket to the kind of senior year memories she'd seen in movies, the kind she craved with a fierce teenage ache. Her phone buzzed in the pocket of her jeans. She wiped a damp hand on her thigh before answering, her smile widening when she saw his name. "Hey, you." "Hannah." "Hey." Ryan's voice wasn't warm and teasing like usual. It was flat, distant, like a call coming from across an ocean, not from the next town over. "Listen, I need to tell you something about prom." A knot of ice formed in Hannah's stomach. The gentle breeze suddenly felt sharp, invasive. "Okay." There was a pause, filled with the crackle of static and the sound of him clearing his throat. "I'm taking Jessica instead. We've just been talking a lot, and it just makes more sense." The world tilted on its axis. Jessica. Jessica Riley, whose locker was 3 down from hers, whose laughter always seemed a little too loud in the hallways. The words didn't compute, they just collided. Makes more sense. The phrase was a clinical blade severing the future she had so carefully constructed in her mind. Her fingers went slack. Denim shirt, still damp, slipped from the line and fell into the patch of dirt below. "Hannah, are you there?" "Why?" The word was a ghost, barely audible over the sudden silence of the wind chimes on the porch, which had ceased their gentle song. It's what's happening, okay? I'm sorry." He wasn't sorry. His tone was one of inconvenience, of a task being checked off a list. Hannah didn't say goodbye. She just ended the call, her thumb pressing the screen with a trembling finality. She stared at the fallen shirt, a dark blue blot against the brown earth. How do you prepare for the ground to disappear beneath your feet? For a moment, she felt nothing but a profound, hollow emptiness. Then came the heat, a flush of humiliation that climbed her neck and burned her cheeks. Every conversation in the school hallway, every shared glance over lunch, every whispered plan for their future, it all replayed in her mind, now tainted with fraud. She unpinned the rest of the laundry with robotic movements, her hand shaking so badly she dropped 2 more clothespins. She didn't bother to pick them up. Inside the house, the familiar scent of her mother's baking was suffocating. She couldn't face the questions in her mother's eyes. She slipped out the back door and ran, not toward the house but toward the cavernous refuge of the barn. The heavy wooden door groaned open and slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing in the vast dusty space. Hannah climbed the ladder to the hayloft, her sanctuary since she was a little girl. It was where she'd hidden from thunderstorms and creed over scraped knees. Now it was where she would hide from a broken heart. The golden hour light of late afternoon streamed through the high, dirty window, illuminating millions of dancing dust motes. The air was thick with the sweet, earthy smell of old hay and dry wood. She collapsed onto a bale, the rough straw scratching her arms, and finally let the tears come. They were hot and silent, carving paths through the dust on her cheeks. Outside, the world went on. A dog barked. A car passed on the gravel road. And then a new sound, or rather the absence of one. The steady, comforting rumble of Eli's tractor had gone silent. The day was over. For Eli, it was just the end of another day of work. For Hannah, it felt like the end of everything. She pulled her knees to her chest, buried her face in her arms, and wept as the last of the golden light faded to a bruised, lonely purple. 2 days later, the sky opened up. A cold spring rain fell in relentless sheets, turning the farm's dirt lanes into muddy rivers and drumming a sombre, hypnotic rhythm on the tin roof of the Parker family barn. Hannah and her father had just finished delivering a load of feed, and she'd lingered, watching the storm from the shelter of the massive doorway, not yet ready to face the quiet sympathy waiting for her at home. The news about Ryan and Jessica had spread through the school's social ecosystem like wildfire, and she felt as though she were wearing her heartbreak like a scarlet letter. The scent of rain-soaked earth mingled with the sweet, heavy smell of hay and livestock. A gust of wind drove a fine mist into her face, and she shivered, hugging her thin cardigan tighter. "You'll catch your death out here." The voice made her jump. Eli Parker emerged from the gloom of a nearby stall, wiping his hands on a rag. He was taller than she remembered, his shoulders broadened by years of farm work. His flannel shirt was worn soft at the elbows, and his hair was a perpetual mess of dusty blonde curls. He'd always just been Eli, the quiet boy next door, a fixture like the old oak tree that marked the property line between their farms. "Just watching the rain," she mumbled, looking away. He didn't press, he just stood beside her, his presence surprisingly solid. The silence between them wasn't awkward, but filled with the steady drumming of the rain. Barn cats, sleek and confident, wound around their ankles, purring with a rumbling contentment that Hannah envied. "Heard about Ryan," Eli said finally, his voice low. He wasn't looking at her, but at the downpour. "He's an idiot." It was simple, direct, and more comforting than any of the pitying looks she'd received from her friends. A small, watery smile touched her lips. "Yeah, he is." He shrugged out of his flannel jacket. "Here, you're shivering." Before she could protest, he draped it over her shoulders. It was heavy and ridiculously large on her, smelling of sawdust, soap, and something that was uniquely Eli. The warmth seeped into her skin, a small shield against the chill inside and out. "Thanks," she whispered, pulling it closer. They stood like that for another minute, watching the storm. Eli's awkwardness was a kind of gentle armour. He fidgeted with the rag in his hands, his gaze shifting from the rain to the barn rafters and back again. "I know it's probably stupid," he began, his words hesitant, "and it's none of my business, but you shouldn't miss us our prom because Ryan's an idiot." Hannah's breath caught. She turned to look at him, really look at him for the first time in what felt like years. His eyes, a shade of blue that mirrored the summer sky, were fixed on her with a startling sincerity. "What are you saying, Eli?" He swallowed, a flicker of nerves crossing his face. I don't do dances. They terrify me, to be honest. All those people," he gestured vaguely with the rag, "but you shouldn't have to stay home. You shouldn't have to watch from the sidelines." He took a breath. "So if you wanted to go, I'd take you." The question hung in the rain-soaked air. Hannah stared at him, a mix of surprise and a strange burgeoning gratitude swelling in her chest. "Are you asking me to prom, Eli Parker?" A faint blush coloured his neck. "Just as friends," he added quickly, as if to give her an easy out. So you can go, wear your dress, so he doesn't get to win, that's all. So he doesn't get to win. The thought resonated deep inside her. It was a lifeline. It wasn't about romance or finding a new date. It was about reclaiming a piece of her stolen joy. It was about defiance, and it was being offered by the last person she ever would have expected. She noticed his hands, the ones he was nervously twisting the rag in. They were calloused from work, the knuckles scarred. But his movements were careful, gentle. She'd seen those hands fix fences, calm a spooked calf and replant her mother's peonies after a storm had flattened them. She looked up and caught him watching her, a question in his eyes, and he quickly looked away. In that fleeting glance, she saw something more than just neighbourly concern. She saw a deep, quiet kindness she had always taken for granted. A loud clap of thunder rumbled overhead, shaking the old barn. Hannah didn't flinch. For the first time in 2 days, she felt anchored. She nodded slowly, the flannel jacket a warm, comforting weight on her shoulders. "Okay, Eli," she said, her voice steadier than it had been all week. "As friends." They sat down on a bale of hay, the comfortable silence returning, the rain a steady beat against the roof. But something had changed. An unspoken current had shifted in the air between them, as tangible and electric as the storm raging outside. Prom night arrived on a wave of warm, stardusted air. The chime of the doorbell sent a flutter of nerves through Hannah's stomach, a mix of apprehension and a new, unfamiliar anticipation. Taking one last look in the hall mirror at the girl in the periwinkle chiffon dress, she took a deep breath and opened the door. Eli stood on her porch, framed by the deepening twilight. He was wearing a dark suit that was clearly his father's, the shoulders a little too wide, but it only served to emphasize his own solid frame. His hair was meticulously combed, though a stubborn blonde curl was already staging a rebellion at his temple. In his hands he held a small clear box containing a wrist corsage of white rosebuds. He looked from her face down to her dress and back up again, his own awe genuine and unguarded. "Wow," he breathed, his voice soft. "Hannah, you look beautiful. I mean, you always do, but wow." A warm, pleasant blush crept up her neck. "You clean up pretty well yourself, Parker," she teased gently. "This is for you," he said, looking down at the box in his hand as if just remembering it. With hands that trembled slightly, he opened it and carefully slid the corsage onto her wrist. His touch was hesitant, but his calloused fingertips sent a tiny, unexpected spark up her arm. Her father appeared in the doorway behind her, giving Eli a firm, appraising look before breaking into a smile. "Have a good time, you two," he said, clapping Eli on the shoulder. "Drive safe, son." The ride to the community centre in his old pickup truck was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence, filled with the soft rock station on the radio and the vast starry sky stretching out on all sides. When they arrived, the familiar gymnasium had been transformed with surprising magic. Glimmering string lights were woven through the basketball hoops, and paper flowers adorned the walls. The floor, polished to a high shine, reflected the lights like a dark, still lake. Eli, clearly out of his element, navigated the loud music and social chaos with a deep-set anxiety she could see in the tight line of his jaw. Yet he did it. For her. He got her punch, made stilted conversation with her friends, and stood by her side like a steadfast guardian. And she found herself watching him, not her classmates. She watched the way he treated people with a simple, unassuming respect, the way his eyes would find hers across the room as if to check if she was okay. Then the DJ slowed things down. The opening chords of Unchained Melody drifted through the gym. Eli stiffened. "We don't have to," he said quickly. "I want to," Hannah heard herself say, and she meant it. She took his hand and led him toward the dance floor. He placed one hand on her waist, his touch light, almost reverent. She rested her other hand on his shoulder. As the song swelled, they found a rhythm, and she rested her head against his chest. She could feel the steady thumping beat of his heart beneath her ear, a rhythm far more grounding than the music. His hand on her back was firm, protective. When did his shoulders get so broad? When did his smile start making my stomach flutter? The questions bloomed in her mind, startling and bright. This wasn't the boy next door anymore. This was Eli. She tilted her head back to look at him. He was already looking at her, and the space between them seemed to shrink, charged with a potent energy. He looked from her eyes to her lips. It was going to happen. A kiss with Ryan had always felt like something for an audience, a confirmation of status. This felt private, sacred. A kiss from Eli, she realized with a jolt that went straight through her, wouldn't be a conquest. It would be a question and answer. An entire conversation without a single word. It would mean something. He leaned in, his intention clear, his breath warm on her skin. "Hey guys, you have to see this." A classmate clapped Eli on the shoulder, shattering the moment into 1,000 pieces. The spell was broken. They sprang apart, a flush of colour rising in both their faces. The rest of the night passed in a daze, but the memory of that almost kiss lingered, a shimmering, unspoken promise between them. When they walked out into the cool, silent night, everything familiar felt breathtakingly new. The summer that followed was dipped in honey and gold. The almost kiss at prom had unlocked something between them, a quiet understanding that didn't need words. Their days fell into a comfortable, sun-drenched rhythm. They worked side by side, Anna helping on the Parker farm when her own chores were done, Eli showing up with his father's tiller to help her dad break new ground for a garden. They were a team. They shared lunches under the shade of the ancient oak tree that stood sentinel between their properties, their conversation easy and rambling. They talked about everything and nothing, the price of soybeans, the best way to mend a fence, their secret childhood dreams. Hannah learned that Eli wanted to experiment with no-till farming, to preserve the topsoil his grandfather had cherished. She saw the passion in his eyes when he talked about the land, a fierce, protective love she recognized in her own heart. He was not simple, he was rooted. Their stolen glances across the pews at Sunday service were charged with a sweet, simmering tension. One evening, as twilight settled and the fireflies began their blinking dance, he took her hand as they walked back from the treehouse, their childhood hideout. He didn't say anything, just laced his fingers through hers, and it felt more significant than 1,000 flowery speeches. This slow, patient blooming was more real than any whirlwind romance she had ever imagined. Then in late July, the mail truck delivered the future. Thick envelopes arrived for Hannah, one after another. She was accepted to State University, a sprawling campus 3 hours away, with a full scholarship for their pre-law program. It was the dream she had nurtured for years, a way out, a path to a life bigger than the one she knew. Her parents were ecstatic, their pride a palpable force in the house. The sound of combine harvesters filled the air, the dust of the early harvest swirling in the thick afternoon heat. One sweltering afternoon, Hannah was inside shelling peas while her parents talked on the porch, their voices drifting through the open kitchen window. Eli had just dropped off a crate of sun-warmed tomatoes from his mother's garden and was lingering by the steps, about to say goodbye. "She's going to do great things," Hannah's mother said, her voice full of love and ambition for her daughter. "She's so smart, too smart for this small town, for this life." Hannah froze, a pea pod held halfway to the bowl. She knew her mother didn't mean it unkindly. It was a statement of pride. But she chanced to look out the window and saw Eli's posture change. He'd been leaning against the railing, a relaxed smile on his face, but now he stood up straight, his shoulders tight. He didn't look at her parents. He just gave a short, clipped nod, murmured something she couldn't hear, and walked away, his stride long and purposeful. He didn't look back. He started to pull away after that. The shared lunches became less frequent. His replies to her texts grew shorter. He was always busy, always had an excuse. The easy warmth between them was replaced by a strained, painful distance. The unspoken thing that had blossomed in the summer sun was now withering in a drought of his own making. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. She found him at dusk, checking the irrigation lines in a field that bordered their property. "Eli, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice pleading. "Why are you pulling away from me?" He wouldn't meet her eyes, focusing instead on a stubborn sprinkler head. "Nothing's wrong, Hannah. Summer's almost over. You're heading off to a new life." This isn't just about summer," she said, her heart aching. "You know that." He finally looked at her, and his expression was shuttered, guarded. The vulnerability she'd seen at prom was gone, replaced by a mask of indifference. "It was fun, Hannah, that's all. We had a good time." The words were a physical blow. Fun. He was reducing their entire golden summer, the slow dance, the held hands, the shared dreams, to a simple pastime. It was Ryan all over again, but 1,000 times worse, because this time she'd let her heart believe it was real. His internal struggle was invisible to her. She couldn't see his fear, couldn't hear the voice in his head telling him that loving her meant letting her go, that a simple farmer had no business holding back a girl with the world at her feet. All she saw was rejection. Tears blurred her vision. "I can't believe you," she whispered, her voice thick with hurt. She turned and ran, not to the barn and not to the house, but into the sprawling cornfield maze that separated their farms, a place they had played hide and seek in as children. The stalks were high above her head, their dry leaves scratching at her arms and face. She ran until her lungs burned, until she was deep inside the green and gold labyrinth. She finally stumbled to a stop, surrounded on all sides, the setting sun casting long, disorienting shadows. She was completely and utterly lost, in more ways than one. The first month of college was a blur of crowded lecture halls, unfamiliar faces, and a profound sense of displacement. Hannah went through the motions, attending classes and joining study groups, but her heart remained in Nebraska, lost somewhere in a cornfield. The city felt loud and impersonal, the people disconnected from the earth and from each other. She missed the scent of hay, the rumble of a tractor, the vast open sky. She missed Eli. She drove home for the annual harvest festival in early October, craving a dose of familiarity. The town square was alive with the sights and sounds of autumn. Fiddle music mingled with the laughter of children, and the crisp air was fragrant with wood smoke, cinnamon, and roasting corn. Golden leaves drifted down from the maple trees, carpeting the ground in a riot of colour. Hannah, wrapped in a cosy sweater, felt like a tourist in her own life. She saw familiar faces, but the conversations were stilted. Everyone wanted to know about the big city, about her new life, a life that felt increasingly like a costume she was wearing. Then she saw him. Eli was on the main stage, standing next to the town mayor. It was time for the charity pie auction, a festival tradition. The final item was a legendary sour cream raisin pie made from his grandmother's recipe. The bidding was fierce, but Eli outbid everyone, paying a staggering amount for his own family's creation. The mayor announced that all the proceeds from that pie would go directly to the Morrison family, whose farm had been hit hard by a hailstorm over the summer. A wave of warmth spread through Hannah's chest, chasing away some of the lonely chill. She wasn't just watching a boy win an auction, she was seeing the man he was. A man of quiet character, of deep-seated loyalty to his community, of a generosity that didn't require an audience. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, too smart for this life, and for the first time she knew they were wrong. There was a different kind of intelligence, a wisdom of the heart and the land, and Eli had it in spades. She knew where she had to go. She slipped away from the festival crowd and walked the familiar path toward the property line, toward the old oak tree that housed their childhood hideout. She climbed the worn wooden slats nailed into the trunk, her movements sure and steady. He was there. He was sitting on the floor of the treehouse, his back against the far wall, staring out at the festival lights twinkling in the distance. He looked up as she climbed inside, his expression a mixture of surprise and sorrow. "I saw what you did," she said softly, sitting across from him, "with the pie." He just shrugged, his gaze dropping to the floorboards. The Morrisons needed it. The air was thick with unspoken words, with the ghosts of their summer and the pain of their autumn. Hannah decided she was done with ghosts. "I thought I needed to leave everything behind to find myself, to grow up," she began, her voice gaining strength with every word. "I thought success meant getting as far away from here as possible, but I was wrong. Some roots are worth keeping. Some lives are big enough right where they are." Eli looked up, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I heard your mum that day," he confessed, his voice rough. "She was right. You have so much potential. I was so afraid of holding you back, of being the anchor that kept your ship in the harbour, that I almost let you slip away. I thought that was the right thing to do." The right thing? Hannah's heart ached for his misplaced nobility. "Eli, the right thing is being honest. The right thing is fighting for what you want. Love isn't about where you end up. It's about who stands beside you along the way. I don't want a life that you're not standing in." The truth, raw and beautiful, settled between them. She told him about her decision, one that had been solidifying for weeks. She was transferring, not back home, but to the state's agricultural college, only an hour away. She was changing her major from pre-law to sustainable agriculture. She wasn't giving up her ambition, she was planting it in the soil that felt like home. He stared at her, his face a canvas of disbelief, hope, and dawning joy. He crossed the small space in a single movement, kneeling in front of her. He gently cupped her face in his calloused hands. "Hannah," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you. I think I've loved you my whole life." Tears of her own streamed down her face, but these were tears of homecoming. "I know," she smiled. "I think I've known all along, too." Under the same canopy of stars where they had almost kissed months before, he leaned in and finally closed the distance. The kiss was not the fumbling exploration of teenagers, but a deep, certain claiming. It tasted of wood smoke and cinnamon, of autumn and forever. It was a promise, a harvest, a coming home. They returned to the festival hand in hand. The fiddle music was playing a lively tune, and he pulled her into the swirl of dancers by the bonfire. As they moved together, their steps finally in sync, Hannah knew their future was still an unploughed field, full of uncertainty and hard work. But for the first time she wasn't afraid. Their love wasn't a grand, loud declaration. It had grown quietly, like corn in rich Nebraska soil, its roots deepening unseen until one day she realized it had become as essential as breath, as strong as the earth, and as enduring as the prairie sky. Coming home wasn't about giving up on a dream. It was about discovering her biggest dream had been waiting patiently next door all along. Vaulting Hearts in Paris. The light in the Olympic Village Athlete Lounge was the colour of old honey, a thick golden hour glow that seemed to suspend the dust motes in time. It was a strange, temporary peace in a city thrumming with the frantic energy of 1,000 dreams. Avery Monroe felt none of it. For her, there was only the cold blue light of her tablet, where a video of her last practice vault played on a silent, unforgiving loop. Her shoulders, sculpted by a decade of discipline, were knotted with a tension that had nothing to do with her muscles. She watched the ghost of herself on the screen, the explosive sprint, the perfect plant of the pole, the violent, beautiful bend, and the upward swing. But her eyes were fixed on the apex of the arc, that millisecond of weightless hesitation before gravity remembered its claim. It was there, in that sliver of time between flight and fall, that she lived. It was there she was most alive and most alone. The Americans. All power, no grace. The voice, sharp and accented, cut through her concentration. It belonged to a rival coach from a European team, holding court with a small group nearby. He didn't look at her, but the words were aimed like arrows. They throw themselves at the sky and pray. Avery's jaw tightened. She'd heard it all before. The whispers that she was a machine, a product of a brutal training regimen, lacking the artistry of her competitors. She didn't have the energy to be angry. She just sank deeper into her chair, pulling the invisible cloak of her focus tighter around her. Or maybe, a new voice slid into the space, smooth and calm with a hint of a British accent. Some people mistake focus for fear. I prefer to call it preparation. Avery looked up. A man stood there holding 2 mugs of coffee, the steam coiling into the gilded light. He was tall, with the lean, powerful build of an equestrian. His dark hair tousled as if he'd just run his hands through it. But it was his eyes that held her, a startling clear green, crinkled at the corners with an easy warmth that felt entirely out of place in this high-strung environment. He offered her a small lopsided smile and nodded toward the coach. "Donkeys, you'll find, often have the loudest bray." He set one of the mugs down on her table without asking. The simple gesture felt both impossibly bold and profoundly kind. "Callum Hawthorne," he said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, his palm calloused. "Avery Monroe," she replied, her voice huskier than she intended. "I know," he said, his smile widening slightly, "the girl who defies gravity." He took a sip from his own mug, his gaze lingering on her tablet. "You know, the horses I work with teach me something every day. Sometimes the strongest ones are the most afraid of falling." The observation struck her with such unnerving accuracy that she felt a flicker of something other than pressure for the first time in weeks. It wasn't pity in his eyes, but a deep, knowing empathy. He saw past the athlete, past the machine, and glimpsed the trembling human heart within. He was from a different world, dressage, a sport of contained elegance and unspoken communication between man and beast. His world was one of patient control, hers was a 4-second explosion of controlled chaos. He exuded a disarming ease that she had long ago sacrificed at the altar of perfection. "I'm not afraid of falling," she said, the defensive words tasting like a lie on her tongue. "I'm afraid of not flying high enough." Callum held her gaze, the golden light shifting across his face, illuminating the compassion there. The distant muffled sound of a marching band practicing for the opening ceremony drifted through the floor-to-ceiling windows, a reminder of the spectacle waiting just outside their door. The weight of it all, the unspoken pressure of nations and lifetimes of effort, settled back onto Avery's shoulders. "The whole world will be watching tomorrow night," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Then we should find a better view," he said, his tone suddenly conspiratorial. "The television doesn't do it justice. The energy, the light, it's electric." He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a low, inviting murmur. "I know a place. A rooftop just beyond the perimeter. No cameras, no coaches, no braying donkeys. Just the Paris skyline and the best view of the rehearsal fireworks you'll ever see." It was a reckless invitation. They were supposed to be sequestered, focused, resting. Fraternizing with another athlete, especially one from a different sport and country, was an unnecessary distraction. Every part of her training, every instinct honed for competition, screamed at her to say no, to retreat back to the safety of her solitude and the cold, hard data on her screen. But the way he looked at her, as if she were a person, not a performance metric, was a current pulling her toward an unknown shore. For a decade her life had been a narrow path, a runway leading to a single crossbar. He was offering a detour, a moment to simply look up at the sky without wanting to conquer it. She looked from his open, waiting face to the looping video of herself, forever suspended between flight and failure. Maybe, just for one night, she could choose a different kind of height. "Okay," Avery heard herself say, the single word a small rebellion. "Show me." The Chateau de Versailles was a ghost at twilight. The throngs of tourists had vanished, leaving behind gardens that breathed a quiet, ancient story into the cool evening air. The only sounds were the crunch of gravel under their feet and the distant meditative bubbling of a fountain. Away from the relentless modernity of the Olympic village, time itself seemed to soften. "I can't believe you got us in," Avery whispered, gazing at the palace, its windows like dark, sleeping eyes under a lavender sky. "My grandfather knows the head groundskeeper," Callum said with a shrug, though the twinkle in his eye suggested a more charming form of persuasion had been involved. A shared love for heirloom roses and vintage Bordeaux can open many doors in France. He led her not toward the grand geometric lawns, but to a quieter, more secluded area, the royal stables. The air grew rich with the scent of hay, leather, and the warm, earthy smell of horses. In a paddock, a magnificent mare with a coat the colour of polished mahogany blinked at them with large liquid eyes. "This is Isabeau," Callum said, stroking the horse's velvety nose. "She's retired, a queen in her own right." He took Avery's hand and her breath hitched at the casual, confident touch. He placed it gently on the mare's powerful neck. The animal's warmth radiated through her palm, a steady, living heat. "Feel that? That's pure strength. But it's a quiet strength. You have to earn her trust." For the next hour under Callum's patient guidance, Avery did just that. He taught her how to approach, how to speak in a low, soothing tone, how to read the subtle flick of an ear. She, who commanded metal and fiberglass to bend to her will, found herself humbled by the simple, profound connection with another living being. It required a different kind of strength, not explosive power, but receptive stillness. Later, as darkness began to settle in earnest, she found an empty stretch of lawn, a makeshift runway. "My turn," she said, a playful challenge in her voice. She picked up a long, sturdy branch that had fallen from a plane tree. "The pole is an extension of you," she began, her tone shifting as she stepped into her own world. "It's not a tool you use, it's a partner. You give it your energy, your speed, your trust, and it gives you flight." She walked him through the fundamentals, the grip, the plant, the initial swing. He was endearingly clumsy. His long limbs, so graceful on horseback, now tangled and awkward. He laughed at himself, a full, genuine sound that echoed in the quiet garden. In that shared laughter, their carefully constructed walls crumbled. They sat on a stone bench overlooking a still pond, the surface a perfect mirror of the deepening sky. The vulnerabilities began to surface, spoken in hushed tones as if they were secrets being confided to the night itself. "When you're up there," he asked, his voice soft, "flying through the air, what does it feel like?" Avery thought for a moment, seeking words for a feeling that had always been beyond them. "It feels silent," she confessed. "For a second, the whole world disappears. The crowd, the bar, the fear, it all just vanishes. There's no past, no future, just up. But then gravity wins. It always wins." She looked at her hands, the calluses a map of her life's work. "And the landing can be brutal." He nodded, understanding more than she'd said. I know what you mean." He stared out at the dark water. Everyone sees the medals, the polished boots, the perfect lines. They don't see the years of wondering if you're a fraud. My father, my grandfather, they were legends in this sport. I've spent my whole life trying to fill their shadow." He let out a slow breath. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm more afraid of losing or of finally winning and discovering it wasn't enough. That I wasn't enough without the horse, without the competition." His fear was a mirror of her own. What was she without the vault? Who was Avery Monroe if she wasn't flying? They were two seas of the same golden coin, each terrified of the silence that would come after the cheering stopped. He turned to face her. The space between them suddenly charged, intimate. The cool evening air felt electric against her heated skin. His green eyes searched hers, finding the same raw honesty she saw in his. He leaned in, slowly, telegraphing the motion, giving her a universe of time to turn away. She didn't. She couldn't. Her gaze dropped to his lips. A sudden, sharp crack ripped through the night, followed by a brilliant spray of emerald and gold in the sky. A distant firework, then another, and another. A celebration somewhere in the city beyond the garden walls. The moment was broken. Callum pulled back, a faint blush on his cheeks, the almost kiss hanging between them, more potent than if it had landed. The air was thick with unspoken things, with the ghost of a touch and the promise of a feeling neither of them was prepared for. They had escaped the Olympics, but they couldn't escape the intensity. The feeling that this too was a fleeting spectacle against the night sky, beautiful, brilliant, and destined to fade. The digital world moved faster than a sprinter, and with far more cruelty. The next morning it happened. A grainy long-lens photo plastered across sports blogs and gossip sites. Olympic romance! American vaulter Avery Monroe and British equestrian star Callum Hawthorne share a secret rendezvous at Versailles. The image was innocuous, just the two of them laughing on the stone bench, but the speculation was venomous. Avery's coach was furious. "A distraction. You're days away from the most important night of your life, and you're playing tourist with the competition?" Sponsors sent concerned emails. The narrative they had carefully crafted, Avery, the focused, solitary warrior, was being compromised. The pressure, already immense, became suffocating. Callum faced a similar storm. His father called from England, his voice tight with disappointment. "Your focus should be on the team, son, not on some dalliance that the tabloids can twist." The magic of Versailles evaporated under the harsh glare of public scrutiny. When they finally managed to meet, finding a secluded spot along the banks of the Seine, the air between them was tense and brittle. The easy trust they had built felt like a distant memory. "This is a nightmare," Avery said, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "They're calling it a romantic fling. They're making it cheap." "Does it matter what they call it?" Callum countered, though his own frustration was evident in the hard line of his jaw. "We know what it was." "Do we?" Avery's voice was sharp, laced with the panic that had been building all day. "What was it, Callum? Nice break from training, a little adventure. Maybe they're right. Maybe this is just Olympic fever. 2 weeks of make-believe before we go back to our real lives." The words hurt him. She could see it in the way his shoulders slumped. "Make-believe?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Is that what last night felt like to you? Because it felt more real to me than anything that's happened in this ridiculous, gilded bubble." "Real has consequences," she shot back, gesturing wildly at the city around them. "I have sacrificed everything for this. My friends, my family, a normal life. I have bled for this, cried for it. I can't let it all be jeopardized by a photo." The sky, which had been a bruised purple, opened up without warning. A sudden, violent summer downpour sent Parisians scattering for cover. The rain came down in hard, slanting sheets, plastering their hair to their faces in seconds, drenching their clothes. It felt biblical, a physical manifestation of the storm raging between them. Callum grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the shelter of an ancient stone bridge. They huddled underneath, the roar of the rain on the archway drowning out the city, creating a private, echoing chamber. Water dripped from the stone and the river churned beside them. They stood in silence for a long moment, the steam of their breath mingling in the cool, damp air. The anger had washed away with the rain, leaving behind only the raw, painful truth. "I'm scared," Avery finally whispered, the confession torn from her. Her voice broke. "I've spent my entire life learning how to be strong. I don't know how to be this, vulnerable, worried about what someone else thinks, what someone else feels." She looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I've spent my whole life vaulting over barriers. Physical ones. I know how to do that. Don't ask me to build new ones, Callum, not between us. I don't think I'm strong enough to get over them." His expression softened, the fight draining from his face, replaced by an overwhelming wave of tenderness. He reached out and gently brushed a wet strand of hair from her cheek. The thunder rolled, a deep percussive beat that seemed to mirror the pounding in her chest. "Avery," he said, his voice a low vibration in the echoing space. "Look at me." She did, and in his eyes she saw no judgment, only her own reflection, stripped bare of all her defences. "I'm not a barrier," he murmured, stepping closer, his hand cradling her jaw. "I'm not a distraction. I'm just here, and I'm just as scared as you are." And then he closed the small distance between them. His kiss wasn't like the one they'd almost shared in the garden, gentle and tentative. This was a kiss of absolute certainty, a desperate collision of two souls who had found each other in the heart of a storm. It was raw and honest, tasting of rainwater and salt and a longing so profound it ached. It was a surrender and a claiming, a silent promise made under the drumming heart of the rain. In the shadow of the bridge, with the world washed away, they were no longer athletes with the weight of nations on their shoulders. They were just a man and a woman finding shelter in each other. The air inside the Stade de France was a living thing, a roaring 70,000-headed beast. Spotlights cut through the humid night air, turning the green field into a stage for legends and heartbreaks. It was the night of the women's pole vault finals. It was the night of Avery's entire life. The pressure was a physical weight, heavier than any pole she had ever carried. But a different, sharper anxiety coiled in her stomach. Callum wasn't there. He'd promised to be in the athletes' warm-up area, a quiet point of solidarity before she walked into the lion's den. His absence was a gaping hole in the fabric of the evening. The paparazzi storm had worsened. His team had likely forbidden it. He'd chosen duty, he'd chosen his path, and it had diverged from hers. The thought was a shard of ice in her chest. The kiss under the bridge felt like a dream from another lifetime. She went through the motions, her body on autopilot while her mind was a maelstrom of doubt and hurt. Her first vaults were technically sound, but lacked the effortless flight that defined her. She cleared the opening heights, but barely, clipping the bar on her way down each time. It trembled, oscillated, but stayed put, a metaphor for her own precarious state. "Monroe looks tight tonight," the commentator's voice would be saying somewhere. Not the confident vaulter we saw in the qualifiers. She felt distracted, heartbroken and utterly alone. With each attempt, the weight of his absence grew heavier. She was proving her coach, the tabloids, her own worst fears right. She had let herself be distracted. She had let her heart wander from the only thing that was supposed to matter. What she didn't know was that at that very moment, Callum was in the fiercest battle of his own Olympic journey, far from any arena. It was a confrontation with his father, who had flown in from London that afternoon. "You will not be seen with that girl tonight," his father had commanded in the sterile quiet of his hotel room. You are a hawthorn. The team won its medal. Your job now is to be an ambassador, to represent our name with dignity, not to be a feature in some sordid gossip column. For the first time, Callum saw the truth. His father's pride wasn't in him, but in a legacy. A name. He was just its current caretaker. And in that moment, he realised that the fear of not being enough had been his father's voice in his head all along. Avery hadn't been a distraction from his duty. She had been a signpost pointing toward his own life. My duty, Callum said, his voice unnervingly calm, is to a person who showed me that my worth isn't tied to a medal or a family name. Some distances can't be measured in medals, Father. I'm done letting you be the judge of mine. He had walked out, leaving his father speechless, and raced to the stadium, fighting his way through the crowds. Back on the field, Avery was facing her final attempt at a height that would put her in contention for gold. She had 2 misses, 1 more, and her Olympics were over. She stood at the end of the runway, the roar of the crowd fading to a dull hum. She felt hollowed out. She closed her eyes, chalk dust clinging to her sweating palms. I thought winning was about being perfect, she thought, a tear tracing a path through the chalk on her cheek. But maybe it's about being brave enough to fall. She opened her eyes for one last look at the monstrous height of the bar. And then she saw him. He wasn't in the VIP box or the athletes section. He was in the stands, halfway up, just a face in the crowd, drenched in sweat from his sprint to get here. But his eyes found hers across the stadium, and in them she saw everything. The apology, the struggle, the choice. He had chosen to be there. For her. A profound calm washed over Avery. The roaring beast of the crowd went silent. The weight of the world, the need for gold, the fear of failure, it all dissolved. Her heart, which had felt like a stone in her chest, suddenly felt light, buoyant. She wasn't vaulting against the others anymore. She wasn't vaulting for a medal, for her country, or for the coaches. She took a deep breath and began her run. It was the most beautiful sprint of her life. Her feet barely seemed to touch the track. The plant was perfect, the pole bent, storing all her hope and heartache and newfound freedom in its curve. And then it released her. She soared. In that moment of weightless silence at the apex, she wasn't alone. It was not an escape from the world, but a connection to it, to him. She twisted, arched, and cleared the bar with inches to spare. The landing in the soft pit was a gentle arrival, not a crash. The stadium erupted. Camera flashes went off like 1,000 new stars being born. She looked at the bar, still resting peacefully, then looked back at Callum. He was just a man in a crowd, but for her, he was the only person in the world. She didn't win gold that night. A rival surpassed her on the final attempt. But as the silver medal was placed around her neck, its cool weight felt different than she'd ever imagined. It wasn't a symbol of coming in second. It was a testament to having been brave enough to risk everything, and in doing so finding something she never knew she was searching for. The closing ceremony was a kaleidoscope of joy and relief. Fireworks cracked open against the Parisian night, showering the city in ephemeral blossoms of light. Below, the Eiffel Tower glowed, a proud golden sentinel, watching over the end of an era. Amid the celebrating crowds, the athletes with medals around their necks and relief on their faces, Avery and Callum found each other at a quiet overlook. The city spread before them like a blanket of jewels. Avery's silver medal felt solid and real against her chest, a stark contrast to the weightless feeling she'd had during the vault. Callum wasn't wearing his team medal. Tonight was not about their accolades. "I'm sorry I was late," he said, his voice soft, cutting through the celebratory noise. "You were right on time," she replied, her smile genuine. She knew, without him having to say a word, what it had cost him to be there. It was a gesture more valuable than any precious metal. They stood in a comfortable silence for a while, watching the fireworks paint the sky. The Olympic flame, which had burned so brightly, would soon be extinguished. The thought sent a small anxious flutter through Avery's heart. The bubble was about to burst. "What if we're terrible at this?" she asked, voicing the fear that lingered beneath the surface of her joy. "When the world stops watching, when there are no grandstands or stolen moments in gardens, when it's just Tuesday in 2 different countries." Callum turned to her, his green eyes serious in the golden glow of the tower. "Then we'll be terrible at it together at first, and then we'll learn. No crowds, no cameras, just us. We learn to ride a horse, we learn to fly over a bar, we can learn to cross an ocean." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small old-fashioned brass compass. It was worn, the edges smooth from time. "This was my grandfather's," he said. "He told me it would always point me true north. For a long time I thought that meant my career, my legacy." He pressed it into her palm, his fingers closing hers around it. "I was wrong. True north isn't a place. It's a feeling. It's you." Avery's breath caught. The weight of the compass in her hand was the weight of a promise, of a future. She fumbled with the simple elastic tie that had held her hair back during the final. It was a worn, simple thing, her lucky charm for a decade. She had vaulted with it thousands of times. It had been with her at her lowest and now her highest. She took his hand and wrapped the simple band around his wrist. "It's not a family heirloom," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's just a piece of elastic, but it's been with me every time I was brave enough to fly." He looked down at the band on his wrist, then back at her. The gesture was a perfect echo of his own, an exchange of personal totems, of private histories, a commitment to try, to build a bridge across the distance that would soon separate them. As the grand finale of fireworks exploded overhead, bathing them in cascading light, Callum drew her into an embrace. It wasn't the desperate rain-soaked kiss under the bridge, nor the chaste, interrupted moment in the garden. This was something new. It was a kiss filled with a quiet, certain hope. It tasted of champagne bubbles and bitter-sweet endings, of a story that was just beginning. They say Olympic dreams last only 16 days, but some connections transcend the closing ceremony. As Paris and its magical fleeting lights prepared to fade behind them, Avery and Callum carried something more precious than gold, more lasting than a record. They carried the knowledge that the greatest victories aren't measured in seconds or meters, but in the rare and breathtaking courage to love long after the world has stopped watching. Shake, rattle, and love. The heat in Memphis in July of 1956 was a physical presence, a thick, damp blanket that smelled of honeysuckle and hot asphalt. It seeped through the thick stone walls of the Magnolia Baptist Church, settling in the basement where 19-year-old Magnolia June Whitfield was committing a sin. Or, if not a sin, then something dangerously close to it. Sunlight, fractured by the stained glass windows of the sanctuary upstairs, fell in jewelled patterns across the scattered hymnal sheets and the scarred wood of the old upright piano. Her Sunday dress, a pale yellow cotton that her father had called the very picture of piety, rustled as she hunched over the keys. The same hands that played Amazing Grace with reverent grace on Sunday morning now carved out rhythms that felt like they could make the angels weep, or maybe, just maybe, make them want to dance. This was her secret. By day, she was the preacher's daughter, a model of quiet conformity. But in these stolen hours, with a pencil tucked behind her ear and her heart pounding a syncopated beat against her ribs, she was M.J. White. M.J. White, the mysterious lyricist whose words were currently crackling from radios all across the South, sung by a boy with a voice like lightning and a sneer that broke girls' hearts. 3 songs had made their way from this dusty basement to the airwaves, carried on scraps of paper she mailed to Sun Records with a trembling hand and a prayer for anonymity. Her fingers found a new chord, a bluesy, mournful sound that slid into something faster, something with a pulse. "Midnight train on a one-way track," she hummed, her voice a hushed whisper, so different from the clear soprano she used in the choir. The melody came first, always. It would rise into her, a wild, untamable thing, and she'd wrestle it onto the page, pinning it down with words that spoke of things she wasn't supposed to know. Lonely highways, stolen kisses, the desperate ache of wanting something you couldn't have. Her internal monologue was a constant frantic prayer. Every note I write feels like a prayer backwards, reaching for something wholly in the wrong direction. But she couldn't stop. This music was the only place she felt truly herself, the only place the suffocating weight of being Reverend Samuel Whitfield's perfect daughter was lifted. It was a language her soul spoke fluently, even if her mouth was forbidden to utter it. She scribbled furiously on a fresh sheet of manuscript paper, the graphite pencil scratching a rhythm of its own. Heartbreak engine, running hot and fast. Got a ticket to nowhere, hoping it'll last. The lyrics felt dangerous, illicit. They were the stories of the people her father preached about saving, the lost souls wandering in the wilderness. But to Magnolia, they didn't feel lost. They felt alive. A floorboard creaked overhead. She froze, her hand hovering over the page. "Magnolia, child?" Her father's voice. It was a voice made for pulpits and benedictions, deep and resonant. A sound that could both comfort a grieving widow and condemn a sinner in the same breath. It drifted down the wooden staircase in a familiar chill, part fear and part guilt, traced its way down her spine. "You're needed in the sanctuary," he called. Her heart hammered. With movements made swift by long practice, she gathered the loose sheets of her devil's music. She lifted a heavy stack of hymnals, the old rugged cross, What a Friend We Have in Jesus, and slid her rockabilly confessions beneath them, bearing the raw, rebellious heartbeat of M.J. White under the steadfast piety of Magnolia June Whitfield. She smoothed her dress, took a deep, calming breath that did nothing to calm her, and forced a placid smile onto her face. As she climbed the stairs, the distant muffled sounds of Beale Street drifted through an open window. A saxophone's lonely wail, a burst of laughter, the low thrum of a world she was only allowed to glimpse. It was the world her music lived in, a world of neon signs and dance halls, a world that existed in stark, vibrant contrast to the hallowed silence of the sanctuary she was about to enter. She could still feel the phantom rhythm in her fingertips, a ghost of the song she'd been writing. It was a secret pulse, a second heartbeat, thrumming just beneath the surface of the quiet, obedient girl she pretended to be. And she knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and thrilling, that one day the secret would have to come out. The sound was getting too loud to hide. The light at Sun Records was the colour of whiskey. It poured through the grimy windows in the late afternoon, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air and curling through the grey plumes of cigarette smoke. This place was its own kind of church, cathedral of sound where Sam Phillips was the high priest and the new gospel was a raucous, hip-shaking beat called rock and roll, and Jackson Jax Tanner was its newest disciple. At 22, Jax moved with a restless energy, as if he were constantly hearing a rhythm no one else could. He had calloused hands from wrestling with his guitar, and eyes the colour of a summer storm just before it breaks. He was leaning against a recording console, listening to the playback of his latest track. The song was a scorcher, destined for the top of the charts, but it was the lyrics that haunted him. They were penned by the enigmatic M.J. White, and they fit his voice, his soul, like they'd been tailored for him. Got a heart full of gravel and a soul full of gin. Don't know where I'm going, but I know where I've been. Who was this M.J. White? The letters always arrived in plain envelopes, postmarked Memphis, the lyrics written on crisp manuscript paper, but the last one had been different. Tucked into the envelope, Almost as an afterthought was a small folded programme. On the front, an embossed cross and the words, Magnolia Baptist Church, Sunday Service. On the back, in the corner, a faint pencil smudge of a musical notation. A mistake. A clue. "Sam," Jack said, his voice a low drawl that cut through the music. "I'm going to find this ghost." An hour later, Jack's motorcycle rumbled to a stop across the street from the church. Evening service was letting out. Families in their Sunday best spilled onto the manicured lawn, their voices a polite murmur against the backdrop of singing cicadas. It was a world away from the raw energy of Sun Records. Then he saw her. She was standing on the steps, bathed in the amber glow of a streetlight that filtered through the heavy branches of a magnolia tree draped in Spanish moss. She was talking to an older man, the preacher by the look of his stern face and black suit. Jack's eyes weren't on her prim dress or the careful way she held her hands clasped in front of her. They were on her fingers. As she gestured, her long, slender fingers seemed to trace invisible melodies in the humid night air. The same fingers, he'd bet his soul, that wrote the notes smudged on the back of that church programme. He waited, the engine of his bike a low, rhythmic pulse like a waiting heartbeat. When the preacher went inside and she began to walk towards the quiet side street where a modest Ford was parked, he pushed off the kickstand and glided across the asphalt, cutting her off. Magnolia gasped, her hand flying to her chest. A man on a motorcycle, all black leather and denim, was blocking her path. He swung a leg over the bike, and in the dim light she recognised him instantly from the cover of a record sleeve in a shop window she'd hurried past just last week. Jackson Tanner. "Evening, ma'am," he said, his voice smoother than she expected, but with an edge to it. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice tight with nerves. This was a collision of worlds she had spent her life keeping separate. He took a step closer into the pool of light. His stormy eyes scanned her face, then dropped to her hands, which she quickly hid in the folds of her skirt. "I think you can," he said softly. He reached into his leather jacket and pulled out a folded piece of sheet music. It was hers, the one with the lyrics for Midnight Highway. Those hands, they wrote this, didn't they? The world tilted. The sound of the cicadas grew deafeningly loud. Her secret, her precious, terrible secret, was staring her in the face with eyes that saw far too much. I don't know what you're talking about." A slow smile spread across his face, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Don't lie to me, Angel. I saw you from across the street. I know rebellion when I see it, even when it's dressed up for church." He took another step, closing the space between them. He smelled of gasoline and something else, something wild and free. "I've been singing your words for 6 months. It feels like I know you, MJ White." He said the name, her name, and the sound of it in the open air felt like a judgment. Tears pricked her eyes, not of sadness, but of pure, unadulterated terror, and somewhere beneath it, a bizarre spark of relief. The weight was cracking. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This music, it's everything I am, and it's everything I can't be." He watched her, his expression softening from accusation to a kind of raw understanding. "Maybe," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "you just need someone to help you be it." He looked from her frightened eyes to the stone church behind her, then back again. "The devil's at your door, Magnolia June. You gonna invite him in?" The invitation came at dawn. Jax had told her to meet him where the city ended and the river began, and as Magnolia crept out of the parsonage, the sky was a soft, bruised purple. Mist rose from the Mississippi like ghosts, shrouding the awakening Memphis skyline in a dreamlike haze. She saw him standing by the riverbank, a dark silhouette against the burgeoning light, skipping a flat stone across the water's placid surface. The air was cool and clean, filled with the sound of morning birds and the distant low hum of the city coming to life. It felt like the world spinning toward possibilities she'd only ever dreamed of in the darkness of the church basement. I was beginning to think you wouldn't come, Jack said, not turning as she approached. The stone skipped 4 times before sinking without a trace. I almost didn't, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. She clutched her cardigan tighter around herself, a useless shield against more than the morning chill. He finally turned to face her. In the soft morning light, the hard edges of his rock and roll persona seemed to have softened. He just looked like a young man with a heavy heart and a hopeful gaze. I meant what I said last night, he began, his voice earnest. Your words, they have a soul. People feel it. I feel it. Music like that doesn't belong in the shadows, Magnolia. It deserves a stage. It deserves a voice. Your voice. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle between them. I'm starting a tour. 5 cities across the South. I want you to come with me, not as MJ White, the ghost in the machine, as you. We can tell people you co-wrote the songs, you can play piano, maybe even sing with me. The proposition hung in the air, shimmering with terrifying potential. It was everything she'd ever secretly wanted. The open road, the music played loud and proud. A life where she didn't have to hide the most essential part of herself. But then the image of her father's face rose in her mind, his disappointment, a force more powerful than any sermon. I can't, she said, the words tasting like ash. My father, the church, they would never understand, it would break his heart. As she spoke, a memory sharp and painful pierced through the morning mist. She was 10 years old, standing at her mother's bedside. The room smelled of sickness and fading roses. Her mother, her face pale and thin, had taken Magnolia's small hand. Be good, my June bug, she'd whispered, her voice a fragile thread. Promise me you'll be good for your father. He'll need you to be his light. Magnolia had promised, and for 9 years she had tried to be nothing but that light, a perfect, steady flame of piety and obedience. This music, this man, this offer, it wasn't light, it were fire. Jax seemed to see the storm of conflict in her eyes. My old man was a preacher too, he said quietly, surprising her. He kicked me out when I was 17 for choosing a guitar over a Bible, said I was trading my salvation for a cheap thrill. He looked out at the river, his jaw tight. For a long time I believed him. I thought you had to choose, but what you do, what we could do together, it ain't cheap. It's the most honest thing I've ever known. He stepped closer, his voice dropping with intensity. Come with me, Magnolia, just for the tour. Let Memphis hear what heaven really sounds like when it's got a little bit of hell in it. She looked from his face so full of passionate conviction to the wide, muddy river flowing beside them. The river was a boundary separating the life she knew from a life she could barely imagine. To cross it felt like a betrayal of every promise she had ever made. Her mother's dying wish, her father's unwavering faith, the safety of her entire world. A tugboat sounded its lonely horn in the distance, a mournful, resonant call. It sounded like a choice. She closed her eyes, and a different voice whispered from a place deep inside her, a voice that had been silenced for years. Mother, forgive me, it said, but I'm tired of being the daughter you needed instead of the woman I am. She opened her eyes and looked at Jax, the rising sun catching fire in his hair. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but for the first time it was eclipsed by a flicker of hope. Okay, she heard herself say, the single word a stone skipping across the water, headed for the other side. I'll go. 3 weeks felt like a lifetime. The girl who had crept out of the Memphis parsonage was gone, and in her place was Maggie June. The name was Jax's idea, a little bit of her past, a little bit of her future. And tonight, Maggie Jewel June was electric. The stage at the Cotton Club in Nashville was hot and bright, the lights blinding. Below, a sea of faces, teenagers mostly, screamed and danced. their bodies moving to a rhythm she had created in the sacred quiet of a church basement. She sat at a gleaming black piano, her fingers flying across the keys, no longer hiding. Beside her, Jax ripped a solo from his guitar, sweat beading on his brow, a grin of pure, unadulterated joy on his face. They launched into Midnight Highway, their biggest hit. When the chorus came, Jax stepped back from his microphone and nodded to her. It was her cue. For the first time on the tour, she was going to sing with him. She took a breath and her voice, clear and strong, blended with his. Heartbreak engine running hot and fast. Got a ticket to nowhere, hoping it'll last. A roar went up from the crowd, a wave of energy so powerful it felt like it could lift the roof off the building. She caught Jax's eye, and in that moment, under the heat of the lights, with their voices tangled together in a song of her own making, she had never felt more alive, more completely herself. This wasn't sin. This was glorious. Backstage was a chaotic whirlwind of roadies, smoke and adrenaline. As the applause finally faded, Jax grabbed her hand, his eyes shining with a fierce pride. "Don't you see?" he said, his voice hoarse over the din. "This is who you're meant to be, wild and free and real." He pulled her into a small, cluttered dressing room away from the noise. The energy from the stage still crackled between them, an invisible current that had been building for weeks. It was in the shared glances, the hands that brushed in passing, the harmony of their voices. Now, in the sudden intimacy of the small room, it was overwhelming. He gently touched her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "Magnolia," he whispered, using her real name like a prayer. And then he leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a tentative, stolen kiss. It was a kiss of homecoming, of recognition. It tasted of sweat and success and the promise of 1,000 more songs. All the longing she had ever poured onto paper, all the secret desires she'd hidden beneath hymnals, erupted in a firestorm of feeling. She kissed him back with all the pent-up passion of a girl who had just discovered she was free. Their embrace was broken by a frantic knock on the door. A harried-looking stage manager stuck his head in. "Maggie Jax, there's a telegram for you, miss." He handed her the small yellow envelope. Her heart, which had been soaring moments before, plummeted. Telegrams only ever meant one thing. Her hand trembled as she tore it open. The stark black letters seemed to leap off the page. "Reverend Whitfield suffered acute heart attack. Critical. Come home. Church prays for your soul. Deacon Morrison." The roar of the crowd, still echoing in her ears, was replaced by a terrible, deafening silence. The world spun out of focus. "Church prays for your soul." The words were a condemnation, a verdict. They weren't just praying for her father's health, they were blaming her for its failure. Her fall from grace had, in their eyes, literally broken her father's heart. The taste of triumph turned to ash in her mouth. The joy she'd felt on stage, the passion of Jax's kiss, now felt like a terrible, selfish betrayal. She looked from the telegram to Jax's worried face, and the beautiful, vibrant world they had started to build together crumbled into dust. She had chosen the fire, and in doing so she had burned down everything she'd left behind. The cost of her song was a price she wasn't sure she could bear to pay. 6 months later, the pews of Magnolia Baptist Church were filled for Sunday service. The Memphis heat was just as oppressive, but inside Magnolia's heart a fragile winter had given way to a tentative spring. She had come home, she had sat by her father's bedside, read him scripture, and held his hand through the long, quiet nights of his recovery. She had been the dutiful daughter once more, and in the crucible of that shared vulnerability, something had shifted between them. Her father, Reverend Samuel Whitfield, sat in the front pew, paler and thinner, but with a new softness in his eyes. His brush with mortality had scraped away some of the rigid certainty, leaving behind a man who was beginning to understand that God's world was wider and more mysterious than he had ever preached. Magnolia sat at the old upright piano, the same one where her secrets had been born. She was supposed to be playing the prelude, a traditional rendition of It Is Well With My Soul. Her fingers moved over the keys, the familiar chords filling the sanctuary. But the music inside her, the insistent, rebellious rhythm she had tried so hard to silence, would not die. It was a part of her soul, as sacred as any hymn. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began to change the rhythm. A subtle syncopation crept into the left hand, a bluesy note slid into the melody. It was still the beloved hymn, but it now had a heartbeat, a gentle sway, a touch of the Beale Street soul she carried within her. A few heads in the congregation lifted. Deacon Morrison shot her a sharp, questioning look, but her father simply closed his eyes, a faint, knowing smile gracing his lips. As the last, transformed chord faded into the hallowed silence, the back door of the church creaked open. Jack stood there, framed in the morning light. He wasn't the swaggering rock star from the stage. He looked humbled, his usual restless energy replaced by a quiet reverence. He had performed their songs for months without her, and he'd discovered they were just words and notes. She had been the soul. His eyes found hers across the sanctuary, and in that single look, 6 months of pain, guilt, and longing were communicated and understood. After the service, her father approached them in the shade of the old magnolia tree. He looked at Jax, not with condemnation, but with a thoughtful curiosity. "Mr. Tanner," he said, his voice weaker but still resonant, "I have spent my life preaching about the word, but I am learning that the Lord speaks in many voices, even," he added with a glance at his daughter, "through guitars and drums." He placed a hand on Magnolia's shoulder. "I listened to one of your records, the one about the highway." He paused. "It sounded like a psalm for the lonely. Go, child, sing your psalms. Just promise me you'll remember the way home." It wasn't just permission, it was a blessing. Tears streamed down Magnolia's face as she hugged her father, a lifetime of fear and guilt washing away in a tide of grace. Later, standing with Jax by the riverbank where he'd first made his offer, they planned a new future, a new tour, one that didn't run from her roots but embraced them. They would write songs that bridged the gap between Saturday night and Sunday morning, between the sinner and the saint. Their wedding was held a year later in the same church where it all began. The stained glass windows cast their jewelled light on a strange and beautiful scene. Magnolia wore a simple white dress, her hair unbound. Jack stood beside her, his hand steady in hers. In the corner, his rockabilly band stood ready, not with amplifiers, but with acoustic guitars and a stand-up bass. When the ceremony was over, they didn't play the traditional wedding march. Instead, the first notes of Amazing Grace filled the sanctuary, played with a slow, soulful rockabilly swing. And as Magnolia and Jax walked down the aisle, the congregation, once so rigid in their piety, rose to their feet. They began to clap, then to sway, and soon the people of Magnolia Baptist Church were dancing, their joy a new and unconventional prayer. Love, they were all discovering, had a way of making all things sacred. It was the bridge between what was and what could be, the song that turned rebels into believers, and believers into something beautifully, wonderfully human. It was the rhythm that two hearts find together, the moment the real music begins. Catherine Mitchell ran her fingertips along the spines of weathered books, pausing occasionally to pull one from its resting place. The musty scent that filled Grayson's antiquarian books had become as familiar to her as her own apartment. At 28, her life had settled into comfortable predictability. weekdays at the New York Public Library where she worked as a reference librarian, and weekends hunting through second-hand bookshops for overlooked treasures. "Found anything worthwhile today, Katie?" Mr. Grayson called from behind the counter, where he was carefully reattaching the cover of a first edition Hemingway. "Nothing yet, but I can feel something waiting for me," she replied, pushing her wire-rimmed glasses back up her nose. Her mother always said she had a sixth sense for books, an ability to know when something special was nearby. Today, that sense led her to the back corner of the shop to a section she'd browsed dozens of times before. But somehow, a slim volume with a faded blue spine caught her eye, as if it had materialized from nowhere. She carefully extracted it from between two larger tomes. The Quiet Hours by Elizabeth Harmon. Catherine had never heard of the author, but the title resonated with her. The book wasn't particularly valuable, a 1950s novel that had likely enjoyed modest success before fading into obscurity. But when she opened it, her breath caught. The margins were filled with handwriting, not the occasional underline or star that readers sometimes left, but entire paragraphs of thoughtful commentary. The penmanship was distinctive, slightly slanted to the right, with crisp consonants and flowing loops. Harmon captures the essence of solitude without making it seem pathetic, read one note beside a description of the protagonist walking alone through autumn woods. There's dignity in choosing one's own company, in listening to thoughts that can only be heard in silence. Catherine found herself scanning pages, not for the author's words, but for the annotations. The unknown reader had engaged with the text as if in conversation with it, challenging some passages and expressing deep appreciation for others. There was humour. If I wrote a letter this melodramatic, I'd burn it before the ink dried. An unexpected vulnerability. I've stood at this same precipice, wondering if anyone would notice if I simply stepped off. She checked the inside cover and found what she was looking for. A name written in the same distinctive hand. Gary Wilson, 1968. Catherine bought the book without hesitation, paying more than its objective worth, but far less than its value to her. That evening, curled in her apartment's window seat as rain tapped against the glass, she read the entire novel, letting Gary Wilson's commentary guide her through the story. By midnight, she had made her decision. She would find him. The search proved more challenging than she'd anticipated. This was 1974, before the internet would make locating people a trivial matter. The New York phone directory listed 12 Gary Wilsons, none of whom, when carefully called, admitted to annotating old novels. Library records offered no help. Bookstore owners shook their heads. 3 weeks later, Catherine caught a break. Mr. Grayson remembered a customer named Wilson, who had sold a collection of books the previous year. A decent fellow, former English professor, I believe, left an address for tax purposes. The address led to a brownstone in Brooklyn Heights. Catherine stood on the sidewalk for 20 minutes, rehearsing what she would say, before finally mailing a letter instead. She wrote and rewrote it 7 times. Dear Mr. Wilson, my name is Catherine Mitchell. Recently I purchased a copy of Elizabeth Harmon's The Quiet Hours from Grayson's Antiquarian Books. I believe it once belonged to you, as it contains margin notes signed with your name. I hope you don't find this letter strange or intrusive, but I felt compelled to reach out. Your annotations transformed my experience of the novel. Your insights, humour and honesty spoke to me in ways the original text couldn't alone. I'm a librarian who has read thousands of books, but I've never encountered marginalia that felt like finding a kindred spirit across time. I simply wanted to thank you for inadvertently sharing your thoughts with a stranger. With appreciation, Catherine Mitchell. She included her return address, but expected nothing in response. 3 weeks later, an envelope arrived, postmarked from a town she'd never heard of upstate. Dear Miss Mitchell, your letter provided the most pleasant surprise I've received in years. I'd completely forgotten about that old copy of The Quiet Hours, and I'm mildly embarrassed to know my scribbles have been exposed to discerning eyes. In my defence, I never expected anyone else to read those notes. They were conversations I was having with myself as much as with Harmon's text. I'm curious which passages resonated with you. The novel affected me deeply during a transitional period in my life when I was questioning many of my previous certainties. Perhaps that's why I couldn't keep my thoughts contained. If you're inclined to continue this unexpected correspondence, I would welcome hearing your thoughts on the book or on any other matter that interests you. Sincerely, Gary Wilson. Catherine wrote back the same evening, this time without agonising over every word. She quoted his annotation about solitude having dignity and explained how it had articulated something she'd felt but never named. She mentioned her favourite bookshops in the city and asked if he had recommendations. 2 weeks later, Gary's response arrived, longer this time, with observations about Catherine's observations and a list of bookstores worth visiting if she ever found herself in Albany. He asked about her work as a librarian and shared an anecdote about a memorable library from his childhood. By the third exchange, they had abandoned the formality of Dear Miss Mitchell and Mr. Wilson for first names. By the sixth letter, Catherine found herself sharing stories she had never told anyone, about the death of her father when she was 12, about a novel she'd started writing but abandoned, about her growing sense that life was passing her by while she watched from behind a reference desk. Gary's letters revealed a man who thought deeply but wore his intelligence lightly. He had taught English literature at a small college before leaving to write a book, which remained stubbornly unfinished, he admitted. He lived alone but didn't seem lonely, describing walks through woods near his home and conversations with an elderly neighbour who was teaching him to play chess. I've always believed that what we notice reveals more about us than what we say, he wrote in one letter. And I notice, Catherine, that your letters have become the highlight of my month. I find myself checking the mailbox with an eagerness that would embarrass me if anyone witnessed it. Catherine knew precisely what he meant. She had begun rushing home from work to check her mail, and on days when a letter from Gary waited, she would save it, preparing a cup of tea and settling into her favourite chair before carefully opening the envelope. In July, she sent him a pressed violet she'd found in Central Park. In August, he sent her a photograph of a spectacular sunset over a lake, with a note, "Wished you could see this. Words failed me." By September, the closing lines of their letters had evolved from "sincerely" to "with warm regards" to "thinking of you." Catherine found herself imagining his voice, his laugh, the way his face might change when he was considering a difficult question. Then came the letter she had both hoped for and dreaded. "Catherine, 6 months of letters, and I feel I know you better than people I've spoken with daily for years. There's a freedom in writing that conversation sometimes lacks, the space to consider words before committing to them, the absence of distracting facial expressions or interruptions. Yet I find myself increasingly curious about the woman behind these thoughtful letters. The way you tilt your head when you're listening intently, I imagine you do this. The sound of your laugh, whether you gesture when you speak as expressively as you write. I'll be in New York on October 12th. Would you consider meeting? I suggest Penn Station at 4 p.m. I'll be standing by the Neddick's hot dog stand holding a purple tulip. Your favourite flower, if I remember correctly from your April letter. If this suggestion makes you uncomfortable, I completely understand. Our correspondence has been a gift regardless. Thinking of you, Gary." Catherine read the letter 12 times. She wrote 4 different responses before settling on the simplest. "Yes, I'll be there. Looking forward to it more than I can say." October 12th arrived with Catherine in a state of nervous excitement she hadn't experienced since childhood, Christmases. She changed outfits 5 times before settling on a rust-coloured dress that complemented her auburn hair and a camel coat against the autumn chill. She arrived at Penn Station 20 minutes early, then decided to walk around the block to calm her racing heart, which made her 5 minutes late. The station buzzed with Saturday afternoon travellers. Catherine scanned the crowd looking for the promised purple tulip. Her imagination had constructed a Gary Wilson who matched his letters, thoughtful eyes, an easy smile, perhaps greying at the temples though she imagined him around her age. Then she saw it, a single purple tulip held aloft above the crowd. Catherine navigated through groups of travellers, her pulse hammering in her ears. As she drew closer, her step faltered. The man holding the tulip was at least in his 60s, with silver hair and the slightly stooped posture of someone who had spent decades hunched over books. He wore a tweed jacket with leather elbow patches and a neatly trimmed beard. His eyes, keen and blue, scanned the crowd. Catherine felt a confusing mixture of emotions, disappointment, yes, but also curiosity and a stubborn affection for the mind she had come to know through his words. Age was just a number, she told herself, though the number was larger than she had anticipated. She approached him with a smile she hoped didn't reveal her surprise. "Gary, I'm Catherine." The man's face brightened. "Catherine, wonderful to meet you at last." He extended his hand, which she shook. His grip was warm and firm. "I was beginning to think you might have changed your mind." "Just circling the block to settle my nerves," she admitted. "Understandable. It's not every day one meets a pen pal who started as a book margin." He gestured toward a nearby bench. "Shall we sit for a moment before we head out? I thought we might walk through Bryant Park if that appeals to you." They sat, and Gary asked about her work, referring to specific details from her letters with impressive recall. Catherine found herself relaxing despite her initial shock. This was the same thoughtful person she'd come to know, just packaged differently than she had imagined. After about 15 minutes of conversation, Gary checked his watch and smiled. "I believe we should be moving along now." "Of course," Catherine said, gathering her purse. Gary stood and looked over Catherine's shoulder, raising his hand in a beckoning gesture. She turned to see a young man approaching, tall with dark hair and the same striking blue eyes as the man beside her. He wore a navy peacoat and carried a book. The older man's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Catherine Mitchell, may I introduce my son, Gary Wilson Jr.? Catherine's mouth fell open. She looked between the two men in confusion. The younger Gary extended his hand, his expression both amused and apologetic. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Catherine. I hope my father hasn't been too awful." "Your father," Catherine repeated, feeling as if she had stepped into an alternate reality. Gary Sr. chuckled. "I may have neglected to specify which Gary Wilson annotated that book. Junior inherited not only my name, but my tendency to argue with authors in the margins." "This was your idea, wasn't it?" Catherine asked Gary's father with fond exasperation. "Entirely," the older man admitted without a trace of remorse. "When Junior told me about this fascinating librarian he'd been corresponding with, I insisted on vetting you first. Call it paternal prerogative." Catherine looked at Gary Jr., understanding dawning. "You wrote the letters?" He nodded, colour rising in his cheeks. "Every word. Dad just thought it would be funny to make sure you weren't some sort of book-obsessed axe murderer," Gary Sr. finished cheerfully. "I approve, by the way. She's exactly as she seemed in the letters, Junior." Catherine couldn't help herself. She burst into laughter, the kind that comes from relief and absurdity colliding. When she could speak again, she playfully punched Gary Sr. in the arm. "That was terrible of you." "Guilty as charged," he agreed, not looking remotely contrite. "But now that we've established you're not dangerous, unless one counts that right hook, I should head home before my wife thinks I've run off with a mistress." He winked at Catherine, then clasped his son's shoulder. "Don't mess this up, Junior." As Gary Sr. walked away, his son turned to Catherine with a mixture of embarrassment and hope. "I swear this wasn't my idea. I'd understand completely if you want to call it a day after this." Catherine studied him, the same height as his father but with broader shoulders, the same intelligent eyes but with laugh lines still in their early stages. He was holding a weathered copy of T.S. Eliot's collected poems. "Do you argue with Eliot in the margins too?" she asked. He glanced down at the book in his hands and smiled. "Constantly. He's brilliant but occasionally insufferable." "I think," Catherine said slowly, "that I'd still like to take that walk, if the offer stands. I have a lot of questions about a certain annotated novel." They walked from Penn Station to Bryant Park, the October afternoon softening into early evening. Gary explained how the book had ended up at the bookstore. "I was between apartments last year and had to sell some of my library. I tried to keep the books I'd annotated, but a few slipped through. I had to pack in a hurry when my old lease ended unexpectedly." "Including The Quiet Hours," Catherine said, "which somehow found its way to you." He glanced at her with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Dad calls that literary fate." The initial awkwardness dissolved as they fell into the easy rhythm they had established through letters. Gary asked about the reference question she had mentioned in her last letter, a woman researching the history of female lighthouse keepers, and Catherine found herself gesturing animatedly as she described helping the patron find obscure historical records. "You do tilt your head when you're interested in something," Gary observed, looking pleased. "I'd imagine that." Catherine felt heat rise to her cheeks. "What else did you imagine?" "That you'd be thoughtful and articulate in person, not just on paper, that your laugh would be genuine, that you'd call me out if I said something pretentious." He hesitated, then added more quietly, "that I'd feel as comfortable with you in person as I did writing to you." "And do you?" she asked. "More so," he admitted. "Letters let you curate yourself. This is messier, but better." They found an empty bench in Bryant Park and sat watching the last golden light fade from the sky. A street musician played saxophone nearby, the notes floating through the crisp air. "Tell me something you didn't put in a letter," Catherine said. Gary considered this. "I'm terrified of heights but love flying, which makes no sense. I can recite the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock from memory because I had an impossibly strict professor who required it. And," he paused, "I almost didn't write back after your first letter, because I was afraid the reality of me wouldn't live up to whatever you imagined, based on those margin notes." "I'm glad you did," Catherine said. "Even if your father's prank nearly gave me a heart attack." "Your turn," Gary said. "Something you didn't write." Catherine thought for a moment. "I sleep with the window open, even in winter. I've kept every birthday card I've ever received in a box under my bed, and I've reread your letters so many times I've practically memorized them." The admission hung between them, a vulnerability offered without expectation. Gary reached over and took her hand, his fingers warm despite the cooling evening. "Would you like to get dinner?" he asked. "There's a little Italian place near here that serves tiramisu that might change your life." "That sounds perfect," Catherine said. The restaurant was tucked away on a side street, with candles in empty Chianti bottles and checkered tablecloths. Over pasta and red wine, they discussed books they loved and ones they couldn't finish, the merits of first-person versus third-person narration, and whether New York bagels were truly superior to all others. They agreed they were. "You mentioned in one letter that you left teaching to write," Catherine said as they lingered over coffee. "What are you working on?" Gary looked slightly embarrassed. "A novel, theoretically. It's been in progress for 3 years. What's it about?" "A man who inherits his grandfather's collection of rare books and discovers one contains a series of clues to a family secret." He took a sip of espresso. "More interesting than it is currently. I keep getting stuck on the third act." "I'd like to read it someday," Catherine said. "I promise to write notes in the margins." Gary laughed. "That would be fitting." After dinner they walked through the city, intentionally getting a little lost, discovering a hidden courtyard with a forgotten fountain, browsing a late-night bookstore where they challenged each other to find the most obscure title, and finally stopping for ice cream despite the October chill. At the entrance to the subway that would take Catherine home to her apartment in the village, they paused. "I have a confession," Gary said, suddenly serious. "I kept a copy of another book with my notes, a companion volume to The Quiet Hours. It's called The Luminous Dark. Same author." Catherine raised an eyebrow. "Are you bribing me for a second date with the promise of more marginalia?" "Is it working?" he asked with a hopeful smile. In answer, Catherine rose on her tiptoes and kissed him lightly. "Yes," she said, "but I'd have said yes anyway, 2 years later." Catherine adjusted the framed photograph on her desk. She and Gary on the steps of the New York Public Library, his arm around her waist, both laughing at something now forgotten. Outside her office window, Columbia University's campus was blanketed in fresh December snow, students hurrying between buildings with hunched shoulders and colourful scarves. Her new position as Special Collections Librarian had come with an actual door she could close, a luxury she still hadn't tired of after 6 months. Today she was using that privacy to wrap Gary's Christmas present, a first edition of John Updike's Rabbit, run she'd found at an estate sale, miraculously within her budget. A knock interrupted her careful creasing of the wrapping paper. "Come in," she called, hastily covering the book with a folder. Gary poked his head in, cheeks flushed from the cold. "Ready for lunch?" "I'm starving." "Just finishing something up," she said. 5 minutes?" Instead of leaving, he entered and closed the door behind him, unwinding his scarf. "I had a surreal experience this morning," he said, perching on the edge of her desk. "A student asked if she could interview me about my novel for the campus paper." Catherine smiled. The publication of Gary's book 3 months earlier had been modest but meaningful. A small university press, respectable reviews, and most importantly, the liberation of finishing something he doubted would ever be completed. "What did you tell her?" "That she should interview you instead," he said, "since you're the one who broke my writer's block." Catherine rolled her eyes, but couldn't deny the truth in his statement. After months of dating, she had finally convinced Gary to let her read his manuscript. Her detailed notes, some in the margins, others on separate pages, had helped him see the story from a new perspective. "Did you also tell her that the romantic subplot was entirely invented and bears no resemblance to us meeting through a book?" she asked. Gary laughed. "Some things are just for us to know." Catherine opened her desk drawer and removed a small package wrapped in simple brown paper. "Since you're here, you might as well have this now." Gary raised his eyebrows. "Christmas is still 2 weeks away." "This isn't your Christmas present," she explained. "It's an anniversary gift. 2 years ago today, I found a book with notes in the margins." Gary carefully unwrapped the package to reveal a slim volume bound in faded blue cloth. His eyes widened as he recognized The Quiet Hours. "How did you find it again?" he asked, turning it over in his hands with reverence. "I've been in touch with Mr. Grayson for months. He's been keeping an eye out, calling other booksellers. It turned up in a shop in Boston." Gary opened the book, fingers tracing his younger self's handwriting. "I can't believe some of the pretentious things I wrote," he said with a self-deprecating laugh. "Listen to this. Harmon understands that true connection requires vulnerability, but she fails to acknowledge the courage such vulnerability demands." He shook his head. "What did I know about vulnerability at 25? Catherine moved to stand beside him, looking over his shoulder at the familiar pages. "I fell in love with your mind through those notes." Gary closed the book and set it carefully on the desk, then pulled Catherine into an embrace. "And I fell in love with yours through your letters." He kissed her forehead. "I've been thinking, what if we wrote a book together?" "What kind of book?" she asked, intrigued. "Letters between strangers who connect through literature. We could each write one character's perspective." Catherine considered the idea, warmth spreading through her at the thought of creating something together. "I'd like that," she said, as long as we promise not to let your father write the ending." Gary laughed and kissed her properly. "Deal," he said against her lips. Though I have to admit, his plot twist worked out pretty well for us. On her bookshelf at home, Catherine had created a special section, her collection of books with meaningful marginalia. Some contained Gary's thoughts from before they met. Others held conversations they'd had in the margins since then, agreements and arguments and inside jokes captured in ink. And there was space for many more, a library of love letters built word by word in the white spaces that most people overlooked. The end. A Song for Anne. The clatter of carriage wheels on the cobblestones of Hampton Court was a frantic, irregular heartbeat counting down the final seconds of Anne's freedom. Through the thick, leaded glass, the palace rose from the autumn mist not as a home, but as a fortress of gilded stone and suffocating grandeur. Each turret and battlement seemed to whisper the same cold truth. Her life was no longer her own. In Brittany, she was the Duchess Anne, a ruler in her own right. Her will the law of the land. Here she was a political necessity, a name on a treaty, a womb intended to secure an alliance. The autumn wind, sharp and tasting of wood smoke and damp earth, whipped at the cloaks of the receiving party as she descended. At its head stood a boy who was not yet a man, Prince Arthur. He was handsome in a severe English way, his features fine-boned and his expression as placid as a frozen lake. He bowed, his movements precise and tutored. "Your Grace," he said, his voice clear but devoid of warmth. "Welcome to England. I trust your journey was not unduly arduous. The recent rains have made the roads to Dover quite treacherous, which has, in turn, delayed the Florentine wool shipments." Anne, accustomed to the passionate greetings of her own people, could only offer a small, tight smile. He spoke of trade, not of her comfort, of commerce, not of the country she had left behind forever. He saw the treaty, not the woman. She was led through echoing corridors, her silk gown rustling, like dry leaves skittering across a grave. Tapestries depicting epic battles and stoic saints absorbed the sound of her footsteps, their woven figures seeming to watch her with pitiless eyes. Everything was meant to impress, to intimidate, to remind her of the power she was being married into and the powerlessness of her own position within it. Her private chambers were opulent, a cage spun from gold thread and carved oak. A fire roared in the hearth, but its heat could not reach the chill that had settled deep in her bones. Her ladies-in-waiting fussed around her, chattering in French about the richness of the fabrics and the quality of the silver ewers, but their words were a meaningless buzz, like flies against a window pane. Later that evening, at the welcome feast, Anne sat beside Prince Arthur, a silent effigy in crimson and gold. The great hall was a cacophony of clattering plates, booming laughter, and the drone of courtiers vying for favour. Across the sea of faces she felt 1,000 eyes on her, measuring her, judging her. They assessed her breeding, her posture, the slope of her neck, calculating her worth in future heirs. She took a sip of wine, the spiced liquid, a bitter balm on her tongue, and then she heard it. It wasn't the boisterous fanfare of the royal musicians, but something else entirely. A single instrument, a lute, played from a shadowed alcove near the great fireplace. The melody was not English, nor was it entirely Breton, but a sad, searching tune that seemed to understand the very shape of the ache in her chest. It was a melody of longing, of exile. Her eyes scanned the shadows, seeking the source. She saw him then. He was not dressed in the flamboyant livery of the court musicians, but in simple dark wool. His head was bent over his instrument, his dark hair falling across his brow. His fingers moved over the strings with the lover's intimacy, coaxing from the wood and gut a sound so pure and sorrowful it silenced the chaos in her mind. He was an island of quiet intensity in an ocean of noise. He looked up just for a moment, his gaze sweeping the hall, and for a fraction of a second his eyes, dark and deep, seemed to meet hers. There was no recognition, only a shared momentary stillness. Then a courtier laughed too loudly, the spell was broken, and he retreated back into his music, into the shadows. That night, alone in the vast cold bed, Anne listened to the autumn wind howling through the narrow windows of her chamber. It sounded like a lament. The flickering candlelight cast dancing giants on the walls, spectres of her new life. She thought of the cold prince, the prying eyes, the crushing weight of her jewelled gown, and she thought of the man with the lute, whose music had spoken a language she understood better than any words uttered that day. She pulled the heavy furs closer, a single tear tracing a cold path down her temple and into her hair. In Brittany I was a duchess, she thought, the words a silent, bitter refrain. Here I am merely a treaty signed in flesh. The song from the shadows was the only thing that felt real, a fragile thread of connection in a world of gilded isolation. It was a song for the lonely, and tonight she was its most devoted listener. The weeks that followed bled into one another, a dreary procession of grey skies and greyer duties. Late winter held the palace in its icy grip, and Anne's world shrank to the prescribed paths between her chambers, the dining hall, and the royal chapel. It was in the chapel, seeking a moment's respite from the ceaseless political manoeuvring of the court, that she found him again. He was alone, seated on a simple wooden bench, his lute resting across his knees. The cavernous space was empty save for the two of them, the air still and cold. He wasn't playing the sorrowful ballads of the great hall, but a light, intricate piece that danced in the solemn air, each note a spark of defiance against the gloom. The music stopped her breath. She stood in the doorway, hidden by the shadows of the arch, unwilling to break the spell. When the last note faded, its echo hanging in the air like a ghost, he sighed, a sound of deep personal satisfaction. It was then that he saw her. He startled, rising quickly to his feet and offering a clumsy bow. "Forgive me, my lady," he said, his voice a low tenor, richer than she'd expected. "I did not mean to disturb your prayers." He assumed, from her simple dress and uncovered hair, that she was one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting. "You did not disturb me," Anne replied, her voice softer than she intended. She stepped into the weak light filtering through the stained glass. "Your music was beautiful." A faint, surprised smile touched his lips. "You are kind to say so. It is a simple piece, my own." The honesty of the encounter, free from the suffocating protocol that defined her every other interaction, was intoxicating. "I am Anne," she said, deliberately omitting her title. "Thomas," he replied, with a slight nod. "Just Thomas." Their first conversation was a hesitant dance. He spoke of the court with a wry, weary honesty, calling it a gilded cage where the birds sing for their supper. She found herself laughing, a real, unburdened sound that felt foreign in her own throat. She spoke of the music of her homeland, of lively Breton folk songs that smelled of the sea and open fields. This became their secret. They began to meet in the quiet corners of the palace, the disused music chamber with its dusty harpsichords, or the formal gardens where the first crocuses were beginning to push through the frozen earth. He taught her a sad, lovely English ballad about a knight and his lost love. In return, she hummed a Breton melody, a lullaby her mother used to sing. "Music needs no translation," Thomas said one afternoon, his fingers guiding hers on the neck of the lute. His touch was light, professional, yet it sent a tremor through her. The warmth of his shared breath in the cold room was more real than any jewel she'd been given. It speaks heart to heart. Their fragile harmony was shattered the day he discovered who she truly was. He had been waiting for her in the garden when he saw her walking with Prince Arthur, her ermine-trimmed cloak marking her as royalty beyond any doubt. The blood drained from his face. Later, when he saw her alone, the easy camaraderie was gone, replaced by a chasm of rank and duty. "Your Grace," he murmured, his bow now as deep and formal as any other courtier's. "Thomas, please," she begged, the words catching in her throat. "I am a court musician," he said, his voice tight with a bitterness she hadn't heard before. "You are the future Queen of England. There is no please between us." The invisible walls of her station had risen around her once more, higher and more impenetrable than ever. He was right. Their connection was an impossible fantasy, a hidden harmony that could never be played for the world to hear. The engagement ceremony was set for the first day of May. As the date approached, the palace buzzed with preparations. The ringing of the chapel bells, meant to be a joyous proclamation, sounded to Anne like funeral tolls. They were not celebrating a union of love, but hammering the final nails into the coffin of her old life, of the woman she might have been. The woman who could laugh with a musician in a winter garden. The woman who was, for a few stolen moments, just Anne. The threat of discovery and the finality of her impending marriage did not sever the thread between Anne and Thomas. Instead, it pulled it taut, transforming their tentative connection into something sharp, bright, and dangerous. Their secret meetings became more infrequent, but infinitely more precious, charged with the energy of all they could not say in the open. One moonless night, Thomas led her not to the gardens or the music room, but up a winding stone staircase to a small, forgotten tower room where he kept his instruments. It was his sanctuary, a space that was wholly his. A single candle burned, its flame dancing in the draught, casting their shadows long and intertwined against the cold stone walls. "I cannot give you jewels or titles, Your Grace," he said softly, his back to her as he picked up his lute. "I have only this." He played for her then, a private concert in the heart of the sleeping palace. It was not a performance, it was a confession. Each note was a declaration, each chord a question. The music built from a tender, wistful melody into a passionate crescendo that spoke of desperate love and impossible longing. It was the sound of his heart laid bare. When the music finally faded, silence rushed in to fill the void, thick and heavy with unspoken words. Anne found she was crying, silent tears she hadn't realized were falling. "What will become of me, Thomas?" she whispered into the darkness. "When I am his wife, when I am queen, will I remember my own song?" He set the lute aside and turned to her. In the flickering candlelight she could see the anguish in his eyes, a mirror of her own. "I will remember it for you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before his fingers brushed a tear from her cheek. The touch was electric, a spark in the kindling of their repressed feelings. He took a step closer, and the space between them seemed to hum with a palpable energy. "Anne," he breathed, using her name like a prayer. And that was all it took. She moved into his arms as if she belonged there, her hands finding their way to his shoulders. He lowered his head, and their first kiss was not gentle or hesitant, but a collision of desperation and need. It was the taste of rain on dry earth, of solace after a long battle. As if on cue, a low rumble of distant thunder echoed from beyond the tower walls, a soundtrack to the storm breaking inside them. In the aftermath, wrapped in the safety of the small room, they shared their truths. He told her his own secret. He was the son of a minor noble, a lord who had backed the wrong side in the recent wars and lost everything, his title, his lands, his honour. Thomas was a musician not by choice but by necessity, a gentleman living in the shadow of his family's disgrace. The shame he carried, his belief that he was unworthy, suddenly made his quiet pride and bitter observations of the court make sense. His vulnerability unlocked her own. Inspired by his courage, by the raw, honest music of his heart, Anne felt a stirring of her own forgotten artistry. In the stolen hours of the following week, she began to compose again, scratching out melodies on scraps of parchment. The notes flowed from her like a confession, a secret diary written in a language only he could truly understand. But their stolen world was too fragile to last. A lady in waiting, a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, began to notice Anne's absences. Her questions became more pointed, her gaze more suspicious. One evening, as Anne slipped away to meet Thomas, the woman's eyes followed her down the corridor, a glint of jealous calculation in their depths. The heartbeat of their love was now matched by the rhythm of approaching danger, and they both knew that the beautiful, dangerous crescendo they had built could not be sustained. It had to break. The final weeks before the wedding descended like a shroud. The palace became a hive of frantic activity, the sound of seamstresses in Anne's chambers like the frantic fluttering of 1,000 sparrows trapped in a cage. They swarmed around her, pinning silks and velvets, their needles flashing like tiny silver daggers. She stood for hours, a living doll being dressed for sacrifice, the weight of the brocade and pearls a physical manifestation of her inescapable duty. One afternoon, a page brought Thomas a sealed letter bearing a French crest. A patron in Paris, a duke who had heard of his talent, was offering him a position at his court, a prestigious appointment, a chance for a new life, and most importantly, a clean escape before scandal could erupt and ruin them both. The letter was a lifeline, but it felt like a noose. To accept it meant leaving Anne to her fate. The breaking point came not with a clash of swords, but with a quiet, overheard conversation. Passing the king's private study, Anne paused as she heard her name. The door was slightly ajar, and the voices of King Henry and Prince Arthur drifted out, cold and pragmatic. "She has strong hips and a healthy constitution," the king said, his voice laced with the dry calculation of a horse breeder. "God willing, she will be quick with a son. An heir is paramount. The alliance with Brittany depends on it." "She is quiet," Arthur noted, his tone indifferent. "She will not cause trouble. A broodmare." The word screamed in her mind, a brand of hot iron on her soul. Her value, her entire existence was reduced to her ability to produce an heir. She was not a partner, not a person, but a vessel. The last of her romantic illusions about finding some small measure of respect in this marriage dissolved, leaving a bitter, cold emptiness. That night, she met Thomas in the gardens, the wind howling around them like a keening grief. The air was electric with their shared misery. "I received an offer," he told her, his face a mask of turmoil. "From France. We could go, Anne. Together. We could disappear. I would work, I would play in taverns. It wouldn't matter, as long as we were free." He gripped her arms, his eyes wild with a desperate hope. "Come with me." It was the ultimate temptation, a life of love, music, and freedom. But she saw the future with a terrible clarity. "If I run, the treaty is broken," she said, her voice hollow, her heart tearing with every word. "My people in Brittany will pay the price. Henry will see it as a declaration of war. I would be trading their safety for my own happiness. I cannot do that." She looked at him, her eyes pleading for him to understand. "I am the bridge between two kingdoms, Thomas, and a bridge cannot choose its own direction. It can only bear the weight." The truth of her words settled between them, heavy and suffocating. There was no escape. Her dark night of the soul had arrived, and she was utterly alone in her choice. Love or duty, her heart or her people. Thomas looked at her, his own hope dying in his eyes. He saw the iron will beneath her sorrow, the queen beneath the heartbroken girl. He understood. His sacrifice would be to let her make hers. He could not save her from her fate, but he could save her from the scandal of their love. "Then I will take the position in front," he said, his voice rough with unshed tears. He released her arms, and the cold rushed in where his warmth had been. "I will leave before the wedding. No one will ever know." He turned to walk away, his figure a dark shape against the tormented sky. Each step he took away from her was a note in a funeral dirge, the final breaking chord of their song. Dawn broke cold and grey over Hampton Court, the pale light filtering through the stained glass of the royal chapel like a final hesitant blessing. Anne found Thomas there, just as she knew she would. He was not praying, but standing in the centre of the nave, his travelling cloak already fastened. A groom waited with 2 horses in the courtyard beyond, their breath pluming in the frigid air, their hooves echoing her own frantic heartbeat. "You weren't going to say goodbye," she said, her voice echoing in the sacred silence. It was not an accusation, but a statement of painful fact. He turned, his face etched with a sorrow so deep it seemed to have aged him overnight. "A goodbye would only make the leaving impossible," he admitted. "It is kinder this way." "No," she said, stepping closer. "The kindest thing is the truth." She took a deep breath, gathering the strength she had forged in the crucible of her grief. "I am going to marry Prince Arthur. I am going to be Queen of England. But I did not simply surrender, Thomas. I went to the king. I negotiated." A flicker of surprise, of pride crossed his face. "I will fulfill my duties," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "But I have secured a promise. My own household, my own musicians, a measure of control over my own affairs. I will not be a silent broodmare in a golden cage. I will have a voice. You taught me to find it." He understood then. It was not the ending they had dreamed of in the tower room, but it was not a complete defeat. She had not run away, but she had not broken either. She had found a third path, a path of duty infused with dignity. They could not have forever, but they had created something true, something that had changed them both irrevocably. "Your song," he whispered, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "You will not forget it." "Never," she promised, "nor yours." For their final farewell there were no more words. He retrieved his lute from a nearby pew. She took a small silver flute from a hidden pocket in her cloak, and there, in the empty chapel at dawn, they played. It was their final duet. He began with his English ballad, the melody of heartbreaking loss. Then she joined in, weaving the notes of her mother's Breton lullaby around his. The 2 melodies, one of sorrow, one of comfort, one of England, one of Brittany, twined together, creating a new harmony, a song that was uniquely theirs, a testament to a love that could find beauty even in the face of impossible difference. When the last perfect note faded, they simply looked at each other, their music having said everything. He bowed, a gesture of profound respect, and walked out of the chapel without looking back, 5 years later. The bells of London tolled, but this time they were for the death of a king. Anne, now the Queen Mother, a young widow after Arthur's untimely passing, stood on the balcony watching the solemn procession. She was a respected figure, known for her wisdom, her quiet strength, and her patronage of the arts. She had kept her promise to her people and to herself. That evening a package arrived, delivered by a messenger who had travelled far. It bore no name, only a seal of pressed wildflowers. Inside, nestled in silk, was a small, intricately carved wooden bird, a lark poised for flight. Beneath it lay a sheaf of sheet music. The melody was new, yet achingly familiar. It was a continuation of their song, filled with longing, but also with a deep, abiding peace. Alone in her chambers, Anne went to her clavichord. As her fingers found the keys, the melody filled the room. a sound that transcended time and circumstance. Some songs are meant to be sung once, in perfect harmony, their echo lasting longer than a lifetime of ordinary music. Anne closed her eyes, a small secret smile on her lips, and let the melody carry her back to a love that chose memory over possession, duty over desire, and in that choice found its own form of forever.